Hello everyone, my name is Christina and I'm going to be singing Build My Life. Worthy of every song we could ever sing, worthy of all the praise we could ever bring, worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you, we live for you. Jesus, the name above every other name. Jesus, the only one who could ever save. Worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you. Oh, we live for you. Holy, there is no one like you. There is none besides you. Open up my eyes in wonder and show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me in your love to those around me. Jesus, the name above every other name. Jesus, the only one who could ever save. Worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you. Oh, we live for you. Holy, there is no one like you. There is none besides you. Open up my eyes in wonder and show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me in your love to those around me. I will build my life upon your love. It is a firm foundation. I will put my trust in you alone, and I will not be shaken. I will build my life upon your love. It is a firm foundation. I will put my trust in you alone, and I will not be shaken. Holy, there is no one like you. There is none besides you. Open up my eyes in wonder and show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me in your love to those around me.
Good morning. My name is Brandon Cleaver. I'm from right here in Detroit, Michigan. And actually, last semester, I had the distinct pleasure of having Dr. Moore, you probably refer to him as Pastor Moore, as one of my instructors at my Moody Theological Seminary. So I was just delighted when he asked me to come and speak to his church in July. So this is just really a great opportunity. I wish I could be there with you in person, but thank God for technology. This is the next best thing here. As far as my vocation, um, I'm an itinerant speaker with the Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. Now, perhaps you've never heard of RZIM before. Basically, we're a global ministry of evangelists and apologists. And me being here in Michigan, typically I travel within the United States. Sometimes I go out of the country, but typically within the United States. And I speak to high schools, to colleges, at churches, all different types of venues. And the basic message is I'm dealing with the truth, the beauty, and the goodness of the Christian faith and of the Christian worldview. We go around, we answer a lot of different questions when people are wrestling with different claims that people make, or perhaps internal things that they have going on. So it's just really a great opportunity for me as a follower of Christ to engage with a lot of people and talk to them about Jesus Christ. So with that being said, if you're someone who has questions, if you're wrestling with certain things, perhaps you're in a dialogue with someone, you don't quite know how to deal with some questions or concerns that they may have, I'd love to talk to you and perhaps learn a bit more about you and how I can be of help to you as well. So if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. I'm sure Dr. Eric Moore could help you get in contact with me, or you can just email me at brandon.cleaver@rsgim.org, and I'd love to be in contact with you. Now, one of the great things about, I think this week, if I have this right, hopefully I do, is that Dr. Moore said that the fourth Sunday of every month is actually a service that's dedicated to the youth. Now, of course, the whole congregation watches, but it's dedicated to the youth. So as I was thinking about that, and I have 3 kids, my oldest is 10 years old. His name is Braden. And I was thinking about something that I talk to him quite frequently about. And actually, it's in the book of First Timothy. So if you have your Bibles, and I'm sure you do, so turn to the book of First Timothy. We'll read the verse in a little bit, but just turn to that book, and so you'll be ready when we do go there. Now, perhaps you've seen that there have been just an immense amount of protests all around the world. And that's really unprecedented, that there's been these protests that have been sparked by the deaths and the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. The unprecedented and rare part of it is that it's this global awareness that's going on towards these grave injustices. And so on June 4th in Nashville, Tennessee, there was this massive peaceful protest that took place. Now, again, there's been a lot of protests that have taken place across the United States and again, globally, but there's a really unique quality about this one. You see, the organizers had hoped for at least 1,000 people, but they ended up getting upwards of 15,000 people. And while that's an important quality, that wasn't what made it unique. You see, they also only took 5 days to organize this massive event. And even as impressive as that is, that wasn't what made this unique. Also, the 6 organizers didn't actually meet physically. They never met before until the day of the actual march. And again, that's an incredible attribute of this protest. But again, that's not what really made it so unique. What made it unique is that its 6 organizers were 6 teenage girls from across Tennessee, ranging from freshmen to juniors in high school. These 6 teenage girls who only took 5 days to organize this, did it all online, never met each other until the day of the march, had hoped for 1,000 people, and had got a crowd of 15,000 people. I can't remember another time where there's been such a small collection of youth that has had such a massive impact. You know, one of the young ladies, her name is Emma Rose. She's 15 years old. She's a sophomore in Franklin, Tennessee. She was talking to Good Morning America about this protest and how they organized it. And this is what she said. She said, "We felt like we needed to do more because change is not going to just happen overnight. We're teens, and we weren't seeing any youth speaking up because they didn't feel like they have a voice. We wanted to show teenagers and youth that we need you guys, and we do have a voice." What I think Emma is getting at here is this idea of youthful influence. And it's weird, just again, saying youthful influence almost sounds like 2 contradictory words put together in this phrase. And the reason I say they seem like they're almost contradictory, because what are the attributes that we often hear about our youth? Immature, irresponsible, They lack experience, lack knowledge. And many of these are just untrue. And again, this is why I think about this so much with my oldest son, Braden. And so we have this, as we talk about it, there's this one verse that we have on this chalkboard in this room, right on the side of his bed. And it's 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 12. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 12. If you would, please turn to me there and read that verse with me. Don't let anyone look down on you because you are young, but set an example for believers in speech, conduct, love, faithfulness, and purity. You see, when Paul is writing this letter to his companion Timothy, I think the idea that he's getting at in this specific verse is the idea that influence is ageless and only bound by one's character. Again, influence is ageless and only bound by one's character. Now, Timothy was an interesting character because we don't know a whole lot about him, but everything that we do know about him actually pretty much comes from Paul. But we know Paul has told us enough about him that we feel like we actually understand him and have a good sense of who he was and how influential he was even in his youth. See, Timothy, again, was a companion to Paul. And he wasn't just a companion because Paul had other companions. He had Silas, he had Barnabas, and others as well. But interestingly, the youngest of these was Timothy. And he was arguably the closest companion to Paul. You see, the Greek word is often translated as young in this instance, actually, or typically refers to someone under the age of 29. So he was most likely in his 20s when he joined Paul as a companion. Now, Timothy was from a little town called Lystra in Asia Minor, and he actually grew up in this mixed heritage family. His father was a pagan Greek, while his mother was a Jewish Christian. And you see, Paul met Timothy during his second missionary journey. And part of the reason that Timothy kind of stood out and became a disciple of Paul's was due to his reputation amongst the community. He was well respected. And we actually find in Acts chapter 16, verses 1 and 2, that believers in these two separate towns, spoke very highly of Timothy. And that's what sort of attracted Paul to Timothy as a companion. So as you hear about that, just think about that. Think about where we live here. If you live in Detroit, perhaps the towns of Redford and Livonia or South Hill, these two different towns, they know so much about you. They speak so highly of you that you have this great exemplar of the faith asking you to become his companion. So when you think about this, what does it say about your reputation? How would people around you regard you? Perhaps you're watching this message right now with friends, with family, with your parents, with a guardian. What would they say about your reputation? You see, throughout their journeys, Paul sent Timothy as his representative when he wasn't able to go somewhere. So in one instance, he sent him to this town called Corinth. In another instance, he sent him to this town called Philippi. And in this specific instance, Paul was actually going to Macedonia, but there were some issues still going on in this town of Ephesus. So Paul asked Timothy to stay behind in Ephesus because there was this increase in false teachings that was going on. So Paul wanted Timothy there to hopefully correct some things and reorient what was going on in this specific town. Now, since Timothy was young, Paul knew that a lot of people would just disregard him as this young, immature, remember the attributes I said before, immature, irresponsible guy. So Paul identified five foundational areas that Timothy could use to build his leadership credibility amongst these folks in Ephesus. And these are the five foundational areas that was mentioned in that verse: speech, conduct, love, faithfulness, and purity. Those five foundational areas. And although these were mentioned centuries ago by Paul, I think these are still very relevant for you and for us today, particularly with everything going on in our current environment with conversations of racial injustice and just everything going on. Uh, um, we have to be good representatives of Christ. And in doing that, whether you're young or you're old, you need credibility. But this is, again, specifically for the youth. So let's talk about these 5 foundational areas. So the first one here is speech. You probably heard it said before. It's not what you say, but how you say it. Okay, that's totally wrong. Okay, I don't know who came up with that, but what you say does matter. Okay, what you say does matter, but also it's important. It's also important how you say what you say. And Paul gets at this when he gives this instruction in Colossians chapter 4, verse 6. He says, "Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer every person." So what is he talking about here? Well, there's 2 things that I'd like for you to think about with this verse. First of all, when he says, let your conversation always be full of grace, what he means by grace is that when you're engaged in dialogue, when you're having these conversations, whatever you're saying, let kindness, let compassion, let mercy always be the foundation for how you're delivering your message. In spite of whatever else someone may be saying to you and the way in which they say it, the way that you go about things should always be filled with grace. And then he gives this weird phrase, seasoned with salt. Now, if you've been reading the Bible for a while, you've probably heard other metaphors dealing with salt. Jesus actually used metaphors of salt. And why was that? You see, salt during that time was so valuable that it was almost like currency. People would use it to trade and to buy things with. But not only was it highly regarded as currency, but also it was also used as a preservative and as a method of flavoring food. So when he's using this phrase to let your conversation always be gracious, seasoned full of grace and seasoned with salt, he's saying that the way that you engage someone should always preserve the message of the gospel, should preserve the message of Christ, whether implicitly stated or explicitly stated. Not every conversation will end with some proclamation of Jesus Christ, but his life, his message should always be at the center of your heart when you're in these conversations. And then he also talked about the fact that it should be, or this metaphor deals with it being flavored. So when he's talking about seasoned with salt, he's saying let it be flavored, let it be given individually, particularly individually for every person that you encounter. Because when you're in these conversations, you aren't just answering a question. You aren't just answering an individual or some abstract object. What you're doing is you're talking to an actual person, a person who's created in the image of God. And we should always interact with them as such. So that's speech. And then we have conduct. With conduct, there was the late British evangelist. His name was Gypsy Smith. And he once said, that there are 5 gospels. Now, I'm sure that you all have been paying very close attention when Dr. Moore has been teaching. So you'll know that there's not actually 5 gospels. There's 4. There's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But he says, listen to what he says. He says there's 5 gospels. He says there's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the 5th one is you. Most people won't read the first 4, but they will read the 5th one. See, what he's getting at here is that conduct has to do with our behavior, our way of life. So everything that we do actually is representative of Christ. And Paul says that we are actually ambassadors of Christ. Now, what does he mean by that? Now, being in Detroit, I'm sure you're aware of the auto show. I think we have the best auto show in the nation, but hey, I'm probably biased towards that. But people come from all over the United States to come to our auto show. And what is something that you see when you go to the auto show? You see ambassadors of different automobile brands. So, for example, you have someone like Ford. Someone like Ford, you go up to them, they'll have the Ford insignia on them. They'll be dressed, they'll talk the Ford lingo. They'll be aware of the competitors pros and cons of their automobiles and vehicles. And so they're aware of this. So then they can compare and contrast Ford with whatever they have to offer. So everything that they say, they do, they just exude Ford. And for us, as ambassadors of Christ, we should also be exuding Christ with everything that we say, everything that we do, the way that we dress. Everything is reflective of Jesus Christ. So let me ask you something. Does your life reflect that of a follower of Jesus Christ? Are there things in your life that you know don't represent him well? Have there been instances in which you've been in conversation with someone and you know that it didn't go as well as you hoped, maybe because the way that you engaged them wasn't in a Christ-like way? These are things for us to think about as we continue to try to live lives reflective of Christ. So we have speech, conduct, and then love. Now, interestingly, Paul wrote these two letters to Timothy, First Timothy and Second Timothy, but he also talked about him outside of these letters. And in one case, it was in Philippians. So Philippians chapter 2, verses 20 through 24, he says, "For I have no one like him who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare. For they all seek their own interests, not that of Jesus Christ. But you know Timothy's proven worth, how as a son with the Father, he has served with me in the gospel. I hope, therefore, to send him just as soon as I see how it will go with me, and I trust in the Lord that shortly I myself will come also." You see, love is a trademark of the Christian faith. It's a trademark of the Christian himself. And this was something that Timothy exuded just immensely. And there's this verse, I think it's in John, where Jesus says, "Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another." But here's the kicker, and this is one of my favorite verses in the Bible. You know, we talk about apologetics or defending the faith, and I do that, and I talk about it from philosophical angles and historical angles and all these greatest things. But the greatest and most impactful apologetic or defense of the Christian faith is that of love. Here Jesus says, "By this, all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another." You see, it was this type of love that characterized Timothy and his genuine compassion for other people who have been made again in the image of God. Speech, conduct, love, and we come to faithfulness. So if you want to understand faithfulness, of course, or this idea of faith, you go to Hebrews chapter 11. This is the chapter on faith. Now, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1 says this: "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen." So what is meant by this phrase, by this sentence? To understand, whenever you're confused about something, you have to understand it in its proper context. So what's going on in the context of this verse? You see, the author is talking about several important biblical characters: Abel, Enoch, Abraham, Sarah, Rahab, on and on and on. And what these characters all have in common is that they all face different obstacles in life circumstances. But even in these situations, they had faith, or rather they trusted in God, knowing that their allegiance to him in this life would result in an eternal inheritance. Though they had not seen these rewards, they trusted in God. So that's what it means. They had this confidence or assurance of things that they hoped for. And they had this confidence or this conviction of things they had not seen yet. But they had faith. They trusted in God. And interestingly, there are these two components of faith. There's the internal witness, and the internal witness has to do with us receiving Christ as the Lord of our lives and the Savior of our lives. And there's also this external demonstration. And the external demonstration has to do not only with our life and the way we live it, but also in our conversations. So there's a verse, 1 Peter 3:15, says, "But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord, always being prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but to do it with gentleness and respect. So do you know why you believe what you believe? You see, the beauty of the Christian faith is not only that it has this emotional or spiritual appeal, but it also is objectively rooted in history and has this very rich intellectual background as well. So we have speech, we have conduct, we have love, we have faithfulness, and finally, we come to purity. When we think about this idea of purity, let's take, for example, a glass of water that is clear and pure. And then when you introduce something to it, oftentimes of a different color, it'll change the purity of that water. So purity, in essence, is this idea that something has become contaminated or been compromised in some way. And this is what Paul is getting at with Timothy. He's saying, don't let your morals be compromised by sinful indulgences. Now, the first thing that we, of course, we think about is sexuality. Is being sexually pure. And we're called to save that level of intimacy for marriage. And that's very true. But I think that Paul was actually hinting at something larger here. See, in our 21st century mindset, we often regard purity in just the sexual sense. But in the ancient Near East, it implied that as well as the whole of your life. So if you think about the fact that purity is on the end of this list that Paul gives to Timothy, again, speech, conduct, love, faithfulness, all of these things encompass, as well as the sexual moral component, one's purity. He's saying that all of these things that in all these things you should remain above reproach, and it will lend itself to a godly reputation. As we continue to mature, we need to exude humility, and that's exactly what was characterized of the relationship between Timothy and Paul. You see, Timothy was learning from Paul. We should always have someone in our lives or some people in our lives who are wise and mature in the faith and these types of things to help us as we continue to grow and to learn. But the interesting thing is that Timothy's youth did not preclude him or didn't preclude Paul from recognizing that even in his youth, he could be a great exemplar of the Christian faith. You see, I doubt that Timothy ever thought that his name and his life would be talked about for centuries and centuries to come. But it was his reputation, undergirded, and his belief in God that helped that to be a possibility. You see, what those 6 teenage girls did, what they accomplished was phenomenal. And in no way do I want to downgrade that. But let me tell you the difference between what they did and what I think Paul is hinting at with Timothy. What they did, bringing awareness to injustice, requesting justice and things like these are all attributes that God sees as important. So what they did was necessary, but the protest was for a temporary relevancy. You see, what Paul is hinting at with Timothy, with these 5 foundational areas, Paul has outlined for him this ability in these areas to be able to assert his authority despite his youth in ways that will have eternal significance. You see, your reputation isn't just about you. Your reputation is a reflection of the risen Christ. You represent the very God that poured out his mercy and his love on all of us through his agonizing crucifixion on the cross on Calvary centuries and centuries ago. Your influence is ageless and only bound by your character. Don't let anyone look down on you because you're young, but set an example for believers in your speech, in your conduct, in your love, in your faithfulness, and in your purity. Thank you.